Have you ever watched the people who trampled your dignity dig their own graves? My family measured human worth through stock apps, calling me trash for building real value in the dirt. They threw me into a stormy night, convinced they had excised a family tumor. They never suspected that merely 24 hours later, I would hold the noose around their entire financial lifeline. This is not about forgiveness. This is a death sentence for greed. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Daisy Revenge Stories. YouTube recently disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. So if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1. Your kindness allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the video description or pinned comment. My name is Miriam Cruz, and this is my story. The rain did not just fall tonight, it lashed against the glass-paneled facade of my father's Palo Alto mansion like a whip. The storm was violent, tearing branches from the manicured oak trees, but it was nothing compared to the rage exploding inside the marble foyer. "Get out of here, you lowlife!" Richard, the man I once called my father, roared so loudly that his voice cracked over the rolling thunder. He stood in the grand entrance, his face contorted in absolute disgust, his designer suit unbuttoned as he hurled my heavy canvas duffel bag out the open doors. It sailed through the freezing air and hit the flooded lawn with a sickening thud. The cheap zipper burst upon impact, spilling my vintage radio transceivers, copper wiring, and hand-soldered circuit boards straight into the thick, dark mud. I scrambled out into the torrential downpour, dropping to my knees as the freezing rain instantly soaked through my thin denim jacket. I frantically dug my bare hands into the sludge, desperate to salvage the fragile communication modules I had spent the last 8 months building. My fingers were completely numb, bleeding from scraping against sharp rocks hidden in the dirt. "You are a pathetic failure." "Miriam," Richard spat from the dry safety of his massive porch, looking down at me as if I were a diseased animal that had wandered onto his immaculate property. "While the rest of us are building generational wealth and securing the future with blockchain technology, you are wasting your life on Ethernet resilience. A charity? Emergency communications for disaster zones? You are a beggar playing savior, dragging the crew's name through the dirt for a trashy organization that does not generate a single dime." Before I could even wipe the muddy water from my eyes to look at him, a sharp, dramatic wail echoed from the brightly lit hallway behind him. Vanessa, my stepmother, barely older than me and a self-proclaimed wellness guru to her legions of internet sycophants, clutched the lapels of her expensive silk robe. She buried her face in her manicured hands, her delicate shoulders shaking in an award-winning performance of pure agony. "How could you do this to us, Miriam?" Vanessa sobbed, her voice dripping with venom thinly veiled as sorrow. "I welcomed you into this house. I treated you like my own flesh and blood, and you repay us by stealing my cold storage wallet? That hard drive had millions of dollars in crypto on it. You stole my entire future just to pawn it off and fund your pathetic little charity project." "That is an absolute lie," I screamed, the cold rain rushing into my mouth and choking me. I held up a dripping, ruined stack of schematics. "These are just technical blueprints for analog frequencies. I do not have your hard drive, Vanessa, and I do not want your dirty crypto money. I never even went near your office all week. Save your breath, you thief." Richard interrupted, stepping forward to wrap a protective arm around his fragile young wife. His eyes were cold, completely devoid of any paternal warmth or hesitation. "We checked the security logs. You were the only one home this afternoon. You are jealous. You have always been terribly jealous of Vanessa's success in my vision." A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the far end of the porch, revealing a third figure lurking by the massive marble pillars. Brandon, my fame-obsessed stepbrother, had his latest flagship smartphone hoisted high above his head, the blinding ring light attached to the back slicing through the rainy darkness. He was not just watching, He was actively broadcasting my utter humiliation to the world. "Welcome to the stream." "Chat," Brandon said, his voice slick and breathless with dark excitement. "You are watching live as we finally cut the dead weight from the family tree. Title of tonight's stream is Purging the Freeloader. Say goodbye to the thief. Everyone, look at her down there in the muck. Absolutely pathetic." He zoomed the camera lens right in on my face, capturing my shivering, mud-streaked reflection for his tens of thousands of live viewers. They were treating my destruction like an evening reality show, a spectacle for bored internet trolls. The chat on his screen was a blur of cruel comments, cheering on my downfall. I looked from Brandon's gleaming camera lens to Vanessa's fake dry tears, and finally to my father's furious, unyielding glare. There was no misunderstanding here. This was a calculated execution. They had lost their money somewhere else, and they desperately needed a scapegoat to cover their tracks. I was the perfect target, the outcast daughter who never fit into their shallow, hyper-digital empire. "I swear to you, Dad, I did not take a single thing from this house." I tried one last time, my voice breaking under the crushing weight of a shattered heart. "Do not ever call me that," Richard hissed, stepping back inside the warm foyer and gripping the heavy brass handle of the custom front door. "You are no daughter of mine. If you are not off my property in exactly 2 minutes, I am calling the police and having you arrested for grand larceny. You have 30 seconds before I let the security hounds loose." He slammed the heavy oak door shut. The massive deadbolt engaged with a final metallic click that echoed loudly over the pouring rain. The porch lights immediately flicked off, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. I knelt there in the freezing mud for what felt like hours. The icy water seeped deep into my bones, chilling my very soul. My family was gone. My dignity had been stripped away and broadcasted for public entertainment. I slowly pushed my aching body up, my hands cut and bleeding from the sharp gravel hidden beneath the ruined grass. I gathered whatever soaked, useless components I could find in the dark and threw them violently into the rusted bed of my battered old utility truck parked by the front security gates. I climbed into the driver's seat, my wet clothes clinging to my shivering skin like ice. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out my entire life savings, exactly $30 in crumpled, wet bills. I shoved the key into the ignition, the old engine coughing and sputtering before finally roaring to life. I drove away from the Palo Alto mansion without looking back, leaving behind the only life I had ever known, driving blindly into the stormy night with nothing left to lose. The heater in my battered utility truck had died 3 winters ago, leaving me to face the brutal cold alone. I finally pulled off the flooded main highway and parked under the flickering, broken canopy of an abandoned electric vehicle charging station on the dark outskirts of the city. I killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the freezing cab, save for the relentless drumming of rain on the metal roof, was completely deafening. I pulled my thin, soaked denim jacket tighter around my violently shivering shoulders and finally let the tears fall. I wept bitterly. Not just from the biting cold, but from the absolute collapse of every single belief I held about blood and loyalty. My father had not just abandoned me, he had actively orchestrated my public execution. I wiped my eyes with a muddy sleeve and reached into the darkness for my phone. The battery icon flashed a critical red sliver before the screen went entirely black. Panic surged through my chest. I grabbed a frayed charging cable from the messy glove box, stepped out into the howling wind, and jammed the plug into a rusty, sparking power outlet attached to the side of a vandalized charging terminal. Miraculously, my screen lit up with a faint glow. The moment the boot sequence finished, a bizarre and highly complex notification overtook the display. It was not a standard cellular ring. It was a heavily encrypted satellite protocol, the exact kind of high-level secure connection I usually only encountered when building emergency networks for disaster relief zones. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my thumb hovering over the glass, before hitting the green accept button. "Am I speaking with Miriam Cruz?" a voice asked. The man sounded older, his tone deep, measured, and completely devoid of panic. He spoke with the quiet, undeniable authority of a seasoned professional used to handling high-stakes crises. "Who is this?" I asked, my teeth chattering uncontrollably in the freezing wind. "How did you bypass my secure carrier network?" "My name is Elias," the voice replied calmly. "I am a senior estate attorney calling you directly from Honolulu, Hawaii. I had to use a military-grade bypass code because your standard communication lines have been heavily compromised and actively monitored for the past 6 hours. I am calling to deliver some extremely urgent and heavy news. It concerns your maternal grandfather, Mateo." The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Mateo. He was a brilliant, highly eccentric telecommunications engineer who had vanished to the remote Pacific Islands decades ago. Richard had always spoken of him with sneering contempt, dismissing him as a crazy island hermit who foolishly threw away a lucrative corporate career. "What about him?" I whispered, gripping the icy metal frame of the truck door. "He passed away peacefully 2 days ago." "Miriam," Elias stated gently, "I am incredibly sorry for your sudden loss, but I must speak quickly because the legal situation here is highly volatile. Mateo knew exactly what kind of ruthless man your father was. That is why he operated entirely off the grid. Upon his passing, he enacted an ironclad blind trust. You are the sole living beneficiary of his entire estate." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Elias, I appreciate the courtesy call, but I literally have $30 to my name right now. If there are legal fees, estate taxes, or funeral costs, I absolutely cannot pay them." "You completely misunderstand the situation, Miriam," Elias said, the gravity in his voice deepening significantly. "Mateo was not just a retired engineer. He quietly purchased massive, untouched tracts of volcanic land decades ago. Your grandfather engineered a completely self-sustaining, off-grid geothermal energy reserve. Combined with his private liquid assets and global investments, the estate is currently valued at exactly $85 million. As of this exact moment, you possess immense wealth, and you control an independent power grid that major tech conglomerates would literally kill to acquire." My lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. $85 million, a secret geothermal reserve. I stared blankly at the cracked, wet asphalt, the roaring sound of the pouring rain suddenly fading into distant background noise. My reality was shifting at breakneck speed. "Listen closely to me," Elias continued, his pace quickening into a steady, tactical rhythm. "We have a severe and immediate problem. A highly aggressive, shadowy tech syndicate has been trying to force a hostile takeover of Mateo's land for the past 6 months. They are desperate. They need massive, unregulated power to run an illegal, off-the-books super data mining center. Mateo refused their bribes at every turn, but now that he is gone, they are circling the property like vultures. They are using aggressive extortion tactics and filing fraudulent legal injunctions to freeze the assets." "Who exactly are they?" I demanded, the crushing despair in my chest instantly replaced by a sharp, burning focus. "I am sending a secure, encrypted file to your device right now," Elias said over the static. "It is the corporate registration logo of their primary shell company." My phone buzzed heavily in the palm of my hand, an encrypted image loaded onto the cracked screen. Cutting through the darkness of the storm, I stared at the glowing pixels, and the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. It was a sleek, minimalist, geometric wolf head emblem. I knew that logo perfectly. I had seen it embossed on thick, expensive cardstock just yesterday on the mahogany desk in the study. It was the newly minted shell corporation operated exclusively by Vanessa and Richard. The sickening truth clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They had not framed me tonight just to cover up a random financial loss. They had meticulously framed me to sever my legal ties to the family, intentionally destroying my credibility so I could never use any resources to fight them for my grandfather's land. "Elias," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadpan whisper that cut through the howling wind. "Book me a flight to Honolulu immediately. First class. I am coming to claim exactly what is mine." By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was stepping off a sleek Gulfstream jet onto the sun-drenched tarmac of Honolulu International Airport. The smooth flight across the Pacific was a surreal blur of turbulent thoughts, but the absolute luxury of the private charter Elias had arranged gave me the quiet space I needed to recalibrate my entire mind. I had washed the freezing California mud from my skin in the lavish onboard shower and changed into a crisp, tailored black suit waiting for me in the cabin wardrobe. The pathetic, shivering girl who was mercilessly thrown out into the stormy dirt was entirely gone. In her place stepped out the sole commander of an $85 million fortress. Elias's legal firm occupied the entire top floor of a towering glass and steel skyscraper overlooking the pristine blue expanse of the ocean. When I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, Elias, a sharply dressed man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, was waiting to greet me. He did not offer any hollow sympathies or waste time with small talk. Instead, he led me straight into a high-tech conference room, buzzing with a specialized team of elite forensic accountants and private investigators. The walls were lined with massive, glowing digital displays, mapping out the twisted financial anatomy of the shell corporation that my father and stepmother had built. For the next 4 hours, we meticulously dissected their artificial empire, peeling back layer after layer of pristine corporate lies. The deeper we dug into the encrypted servers and offshore banking records, the more the grand illusion of their invincibility crumbled into dust. It was an absolute masterclass in catastrophic financial fraud. The first massive revelation flashed onto the main monitor, and I felt a cold, hard smile creep across my face. The sprawling Palo Alto mansion, the magnificent fortress Richard constantly paraded as the ultimate symbol of his untouchable wealth, was completely leveraged. It turned out Vanessa had secretly forged Richard's signature to take out a massive shadow mortgage against the estate. But she did not go to a traditional financial institution. She had borrowed tens of millions of dollars from a highly dangerous underground syndicate, a ruthless network of loan sharks who charged an exorbitant interest rate of over 30% and definitely did not handle defaults through the civil court system. The sickening paper trail did not stop there. Elias pointed to a red-flagged column of wire transfers that proved Vanessa had also completely drained Richard's corporate retirement fund and quietly siphoned millions in capital from their primary tech investors. She was funneling all this stolen cash directly into dummy accounts to systematically bribe local Hawaiian zoning officials, desperate to forcefully annex my grandfather's geothermal reserve before the regulators noticed the missing funds. Suddenly, the melodramatic, tearful performance on the porch made perfect, terrifying sense. The missing cold storage wallet allegedly holding millions in cryptocurrency was never stolen. It was a complete fabrication. The money had already been liquidated and burned months ago to cover Vanessa's massive, bleeding deficits. She desperately needed a believable scapegoat to explain the gaping black hole in the company ledgers when the aggressive auditors finally came knocking. I was the perfect, expendable pawn. She orchestrated my public banishment to convince their angry investors that the rogue, estranged daughter had robbed them blind and vanished into the night. And what about Richard? The man who constantly touted himself as a brilliant tech visionary was completely blind to the toxic rot festering in his own bed. Elias pulled up a terrifying legal document bearing my father's authentic, notarized signature, driven by sheer megalomania. Richard had signed an unconditional personal guarantee for the illegal super data center project. He truly believed that securing unlimited off-grid power would make him the undisputed overlord of Silicon Valley. In his blinding arrogance, he had tied his entire financial existence, his physical freedom, and his very life to the success of this single, highly illegal operation. I stood silently before the glowing screens, a cold, clinical realization washing over my entire body. My family was not just a group of cruel, calculated monsters playing a ruthless game of corporate chess. They were desperate, cornered animals dancing wildly on the edge of a catastrophic abyss. Their entire billion-dollar operation was nothing but a fragile house of cards completely soaked in gasoline. if they did not acquire my land to build their data center and start generating revenue immediately. The underground syndicate would violently seize their home. The furious investors would tear them apart, and the federal authorities would lock them in federal prison for decades. They absolutely had to buy the land. It was their one and only lifeline, and I was the one holding the blade right over the rope. I stood in the center of the command room, the cool blue light from the massive financial monitors casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floor. The crushing fear and profound sorrow that had paralyzed my body just 24 hours ago were completely eradicated. In their place, a cold, surgical precision had taken root deep within my chest. I was no longer the discarded, weeping daughter shivering in the freezing California mud. I was the apex predator now, standing quietly in the brush, watching my prey blindly wander straight into my territory. "Elias," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and vibrating with newfound authority. "Do not reject their acquisition offer. I want you to counter their proposal immediately. Tell them the anonymous owner is willing to sell the geothermal reserve, but the price is now exactly double their initial bid." Elias raised a silver eyebrow, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his seasoned face. He understood the twisted psychology of Silicon Valley sharks perfectly. If we handed them the land easily, their natural paranoia would flare up, and they would immediately suspect a trap. But by doubling the asking price to a staggering figure, we directly targeted their insatiable greed and their arrogant belief that anything prohibitively expensive must be an absolute goldmine. We were making the bait look irresistible. However, I continued, pacing slowly around the massive oak conference table, there is a strict, non-negotiable condition for this entire deal. I want the entire executive suite here in person, the chief executive officer, Vanessa, the chairman of the board, Richard, and the director of communications, Brandon. Tell them the anonymous seller demands a private, in-person presentation to finalize the handover. I want all three of them on Hawaiian soil, sitting across from us in a closed room, completely cut off from their usual support systems. "Consider it done," Elias replied, his fingers flying across his secure tablet. "And how do we ensure they cannot simply walk away once they realize the terms?" "We build a cage out of their own hubris," I instructed, my eyes fixed on the glowing logo of their fraudulent company. "Draft a preliminary agreement, hide a cross-collateralization and emergency foreclosure clause deep within the dense legal jargon of the final appendices. Make it explicitly state that by signing the intent to purchase, they grant the landowner the absolute right to instantly audit their books and execute an immediate seizure of any and all collateral assets if any financial fraud or misrepresentation is discovered." It was a brilliantly deceptive Trojan horse constructed entirely of corporate legalese. Once Richard confidently signed that specific document, he would legally hand over the keys to his entire existence. Within exactly 4 hours, Elias received their frantic, official response. They swallowed the poisoned bait whole. Blinded by the desperate promise of unlimited power and terrified of their looming criminal charges, Richard and Vanessa did not even have their legal team properly vet the dense document. Their sheer arrogance convinced them they were easily outsmarting a clueless, reclusive island owner. To make the situation even more incredibly pathetic, our surveillance team intercepted a brand new wire transfer shortly after. Vanessa and Richard were so utterly obsessed with projecting a fake image of dominant wealth to the anonymous seller that they actually borrowed another $500,000 from a secondary shadow lender. They used this money just to charter an ultra-luxury private jet for the short flight to Honolulu. They were literally financing their own grand execution just to ensure they arrived in absolute style. While they were busy picking out expensive champagne and taking photos for Brandon's social media channels on their rented flight, I executed the final, fatal maneuver. I authorized Elias to withdraw a massive sum of liquid cash from my grandfather's offshore accounts. We discreetly contacted the violent underground syndicate that currently held the shadow mortgage on the Palo Alto mansion. Criminal organizations care only about immediate liquidity, not long-term real estate holds. We offered to buy Vanessa's toxic debt right off their hands for a 20% premium, paid entirely in untraceable funds within the hour. They accepted our offer instantly. The digital ink dried on the transfer protocols before the sun even set over the Pacific. The profound weight of that transaction settled into my bones. I was no longer just the owner of the geothermal land they desperately needed to survive. I was now their sole, absolute creditor. I legally owned the very roof over their heads, the manicured lawn I was violently thrown onto, and every single piece of expensive furniture inside that hollow house. The next morning, the day of the final meeting, the tropical sun rose bright and hot over Honolulu. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my private executive suite at the law firm. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray power suit that felt exactly like modern armor. My hair was pulled back into a tight, severe style. There was absolutely no trace left of the soft, accommodating girl who used to beg for Richard's pathetic scraps of approval. I reached into the polished wooden box Elias had given me and pulled out my grandfather Mateo's heavy vintage mechanical watch. I strapped the worn leather band tightly to my wrist. The rhythmic, analog ticking of the gears echoed loudly in the quiet, perfectly air-conditioned room. It was the exact sound of my family's time permanently running out. I adjusted my collar, took one last deep breath, and walked out the heavy wooden door, fully prepared to deliver the greatest and most devastating performance of my entire life. I sat perfectly still in the pitch-black observation room. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady rhythm above me. Through the massive, soundproof one-way mirror, the absolute pinnacle of Honolulu corporate luxury was on full display. The heavy double doors of the main boardroom swung open, and the circus finally arrived. Richard, Vanessa and Brandon marched into the pristine glass and steel room, reeking of manufactured importance. Brandon immediately hoisted his phone high, the blinding ring light reflecting heavily off the panoramic windows that overlooked the ocean. "What is up, chat?" Brandon yelled into his device, completely ignoring the solemn atmosphere of a multi-million-dollar legal firm. "We are live from paradise, baby. We are about to lock down a monster acquisition that is going to flip the entire tech world upside down. This is what generational wealth looks like. People, take notes. Look at this conference table. Guys, solid mahogany. It probably costs more than your entire college tuition. We are out here making massive moves while the losers and haters are still crying in the mud." He panned the camera around the room in a dizzying motion, ensuring his tens of thousands of viewers saw the expensive catered breakfast spread and the sweeping views of the Pacific. Vanessa strutted in right behind him, wearing an absurdly flashy sequined designer dress that looked completely out of place in a serious corporate environment. She carelessly dropped a thick stack of glossy leather-bound folders onto the table. I knew exactly what was hidden inside those folders. They were the meticulously fabricated financial reports she had spent weeks doctoring to disguise the massive black hole in their accounts. A young, sharply dressed firm employee approached her with a silver tray. "Would you care for a freshly brewed espresso, ma'am?" the young man asked politely. Vanessa took one look at the cup and sneered in pure disgust. "Are you entirely stupid?" she snapped loudly, her voice echoing painfully through the hidden speakers in my dark room. "This is a single origin pour over roast?" I specifically requested an iced oat milk flat white with exactly 2 pumps of sugar-free vanilla. "Take this garbage away before I have your managing partner fire you on the spot. And the humidity in this building is completely destroying my hair. I swear, once we secure the deed to this dirty plot of land, we are tearing down the local flora and building a fully climate-controlled executive lounge." The young man blinked, maintained his professional composure, and quietly retreated. Vanessa scoffed, turning her complaints toward Richard. "The incompetence in this state is absolutely staggering. I cannot wait to bring our own automated service bots over here." Elias sat perfectly still at the far end of the massive table. He did not flinch at her ridiculous outburst. He folded his hands, exuding a deadly, chilling calm. He was the perfect, silent executioner. "If we are quite finished with the beverage critique," Elias said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold steel blade. "We have one final piece of compliance paperwork to execute before my client graces this room." He slid a single, incredibly thick sheet of watermarked paper across the polished wood. "This is a statement of absolute personal liability," Elias explained slowly, enunciating every single syllable with heavy precision. "By signing this document, you are swearing under penalty of federal perjury that the financial disclosures provided in your fancy leather folders are 100% accurate. Furthermore, it clearly stipulates that should any fraud, embezzlement, or material misrepresentation be discovered, you, Richard, waive all corporate protection. You accept total personal liability. Any hidden debts or fabricated ledgers will result in the immediate forfeiture of all your personal assets directly to the landowner." Richard barely even glanced at the dense legal text. His chest puffed out with blinding, catastrophic arrogance. He pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. "You lawyers are all the exact same," Richard chuckled condescendingly, clicking the pen with a sharp snap. "Always obsessing over trivial worst-case scenarios. You do not build a billion-dollar empire by reading the fine print. Elias, you build it by taking massive, visionary leaps." He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page with a reckless, dramatic flourish. He tossed the pen onto the table and leaned back in his plush leather chair, lacing his fingers behind his head. "I am a pioneer," Richard boasted to the empty room, looking around as if addressing a stadium of invisible admirers. "Those parasites who waste their time on charity and community service are nothing but a drag on human evolution. People who live at the absolute bottom of society will never comprehend my vision. They whine about morals and rules because they lack the sheer genius to shape the future. I am completely untouchable." In the suffocating darkness of the observation room, I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass. I stared directly into the eyes of the man who had created me. He was so hollow, so entirely consumed by his own fabricated divinity. He had just signed his own death warrant, and he was smiling while doing it. The tension in the boardroom began to curdle into intense impatience. Vanessa tapped her expensive acrylic nails aggressively against the mahogany table, glaring at Elias. "Well?" she demanded sharply. "We signed your stupid piece of paper. We flew 4,000 miles on a private jet. Where is this mysterious billionaire boss of yours? We have a massive groundbreaking ceremony to plan today, and I am incredibly tired of waiting." Elias slowly picked up the signed document. He inspected Richard's signature, ensuring the ink was perfectly dry. He placed it carefully into his leather briefcase, the lock clicking shut with a final, sealing sound. Elias then looked directly at the mirrored glass, making eye contact with me through the one-way barrier. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I stood up, smoothing the sharp lapels of my charcoal gray suit. I checked the heavy vintage watch on my wrist, savoring the loud, rhythmic ticking of the gears. I gripped the heavy brass handle and pushed the solid oak door open. The thick hinges swung silently, but the shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and deafening. Richard was right in the middle of a boisterous, self-congratulatory laugh. Vanessa was admiring her own reflection in the panoramic glass. Brandon had his phone held high, still capturing footage for his sycophantic followers. I stepped out of the shadows and into the bright, sunlit boardroom. Richard's booming laughter abruptly died in his throat, choking off into a pathetic, wheezing gasp. The smug, arrogant smirk plastered across Vanessa's perfectly contoured face instantly shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Brandon physically staggered backward, his phone dipping toward the floor as if I were an apparition returning from the grave. "What in the absolute hell is she doing here?" Vanessa shrieked. Her voice pitching into a hysterical, grating register, she slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, glaring at Elias. "Did she follow us? Call the building security immediately. Get this filthy trash out of my sight before she ruins the biggest deal of our lives." I did not say a single word. I simply walked the length of the room, my polished heels clicking with rhythmic, terrifying precision against the marble floor. I reached the massive, high-backed leather chair at the absolute head of the table. The chair reserved for the anonymous billionaire. I pulled it out, smoothed the fabric of my charcoal suit, and sat down. I rested my hands on the cool wood, looking directly into my father's wide, trembling eyes. "I am the owner," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, crushing authority. "I am the sole proprietor of the $85 million geothermal reserve you desperately need to save your miserable lives." Richard collapsed back into his seat, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly multiplied by 10. His mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish. "That is physically impossible," Brandon stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his device. "You are broke. We threw you out into the street. You have nothing." "I had a grandfather who saw exactly what you all truly were," I replied coldly. I reached over and picked up the thick, glossy folder Vanessa had thrown onto the table earlier. I tossed it aside, letting it slide off the edge and hit the floor like garbage. In its place, I dropped a massive stack of authentic, unredacted financial forensics prepared by Elias's team. "You did not lose a crypto wallet, Vanessa," I said, leaning forward. "You systematically siphoned millions of dollars from Richard's investors and drained his entire corporate retirement fund to pay off underground loan sharks. You completely fabricated that theft to use me as a convenient scapegoat when the auditors finally arrived." Vanessa turned the color of chalk. She lunged forward to grab the papers, but Elias swiftly placed his hand firmly over the stack. "And since you love broadcasting our family business to the world so much, Brandon," I said, tapping the surface of the smart console embedded in the boardroom table, "I decided to join the fun. 10 minutes ago, I linked the high-definition cameras and hidden microphones in this very room directly to the secure servers of your California headquarters, your board of directors, your primary shareholders, and the federal financial regulators are watching this live stream right now. They just heard every single confession. They just saw the fabricated ledgers." "Shut it off!" Richard roared. Finally finding his voice, he scrambled out of his chair, clawing frantically at the embedded screen. "Turn it off right now. You are destroying the company." "You destroyed the company the second you signed that personal liability waiver," I corrected him smoothly. "But we are not finished yet." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a single, heavily stamped legal document. I slid it deliberately across the long table until it stopped right in front of Richard's trembling hands. "What is this?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the aggressive red lettering at the top of the page. "That is the deed of assignment for your shadow mortgage," I explained, savoring the absolute destruction of his reality. "I used the geothermal estate's liquid assets to purchase your toxic debt from the syndicate yesterday afternoon. I am your sole creditor, and because you just signed a document guaranteeing immediate asset forfeiture in the event of financial fraud, I am executing an emergency foreclosure." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, watching their breathing grow shallow and erratic. "Right now, at this exact second," I continued softly, "my private security contractors are standing in the foyer of your Palo Alto mansion. They are currently dragging your custom Italian furniture, your designer clothes, and your expensive art collection out into the pouring rain. They are throwing it all into the mud, exactly like you did to me." The finality of the statement hit them like a freight train. The fragile, toxic alliance that held their miserable family together instantly detonated. Realizing she had just lost her mansion, her stolen wealth, and was now staring down a multi-decade sentence in federal prison for wire fraud, Vanessa completely lost her mind. She turned on Richard with the viciousness of a cornered rat. "You absolute fool!" she screamed, slapping his shoulder violently. "You signed the guarantee. You signed away everything we had. You were supposed to be the genius who protected me." "You stole my retirement!" Richard bellowed back, grabbing her wrists as they engaged in a pathetic, physical struggle right there in the boardroom. "You brought the loan sharks to my door. You ruined my legacy." Over in the corner, a sharp, digital chime rang out from Brandon's phone. He stared at the screen, his face contorting in pure agony. The live feed had abruptly cut to black, replaced by a glaring red error message. "It is gone," Brandon whimpered, dropping to his knees and clutching his head. "The platform just permanently banned my account for broadcasting financial fraud. My sponsors are dropping me. My followers are gone. My entire life is gone." Richard finally shoved Vanessa away, completely broken, stripped of his empire, his home, and his dignity. The man who had cast me out into the storm crawled forward on his hands and knees. He stopped right at the edge of my polished shoes, sobbing uncontrollably. "Miriam, please," he begged, tears streaming down his flushed, wrinkled face. "I am so sorry. I was blind. You are my daughter, my brilliant daughter. Please, we can fix this together. Just give me one more chance. Do not leave me with nothing." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping shell of a man on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity, no anger, no sorrow. I felt nothing but a clean, sweeping emptiness. "You told me I was not your daughter exactly 36 hours ago," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You were right. I am just your executioner." I looked up and gave Elias a slight nod. The heavy oak doors burst open again. 4 massive, heavily armed corporate security guards marched into the room. They did not hesitate. They grabbed Richard by the collar of his expensive suit, dragging him across the floor as he wailed and kicked. 2 others seized Vanessa and Brandon, ignoring their hysterical screaming and threats, forcefully hauling them out of the suite. The doors slammed shut behind them, abruptly cutting off their cries. Silence returned to the room, the beautiful, golden silence of victory. I stood up, walked over to the panoramic window, and looked out at the endless, sparkling expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The storm was finally over, and for the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. Hello, everyone, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed today's story and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the QR code right here on the screen, or click the donation link in the video description or the pinned comment. Your kindness pays our hardworking staff, helps them feed their families, and allows us to keep creating these stories for you. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.